Good evening, everyone. Welcome to La Maison Française of New York University. I am so happy to be here, to have the Maison opened up finally, to have a few people in person, thank you, and so many people online. And you're here, as you must know, to participate in a conversation that the three of us are going to have in this kind of hybrid way about a production that's coming to the Alliance Française on Monday night. So I hope that when you hear us speak, to prep this, it will encourage you to go to the Alliance Française. There's still tickets available. It's at 7:30. And it's a production of a reading of a play, a wonderful play by the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire called A Tempest, which of course, as you can tell by the title, is a rewriting and a repurposing of Shakespeare's The Tempest. So before we get started, I'd like to invite the most important person who's here to become known by you, and that is Lanise Antoine Shelley, who won't come to New York until tomorrow to start rehearsing the reading, but is in Chicago right now, which is where she works as a director, where she runs a theater company after a 20-year career as an actor in classical theater. And of course, it's partially the interest in classical theater that got her interested in A Tempest from The Tempest, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So the way that we will operate is that I will start by talking to Professor Romuald Fonkoua, who's right here next to me, and who is visiting from the Sorbonne University in the French department, and who is the specialist of French and Francophone literature, and who has written a biography of Aimé Césaire, I don't know whether you can see this or not, that came out in 2010, which I read today. Actually, I read it before that. And I am Judy Miller, and I'm a member of the faculty at the French department, the Department of French Literature, Thought, and Culture at NYU. And I've been around for a long time. And when I was a kid, in my first iteration as a professor at the University of Wisconsin, I actually directed this play with students. So I feel that I know it pretty well. And so now, to get started, I want to turn to Romuald and say, will you tell us a few things about Aimé Césaire, about his importance as a writer and as a thinker, and what theater actually had to do within the way that he worked?
I think that Aimé Césaire is when he writes La Tragédie du Roi Christophe, which is first theater, he thinks that something have been to do with the play of niggers in Caribbean or in United States. And in 1968, he thinks that he can write something like A Tempest. And The Tempest is a way of thinking that he can write about Shakespeare and what Shakespeare thinks about nigger or thinks about African play. And
so when you use the word that you just used,
yes,
you're translating from neg.
Yes, it's N word.
Yeah, so I think you might say black instead.
I don't use I don't order to use it.
Yeah.
Okay. But I don't know what I can say about N-word because N-word.
But let's not talk about the N-word. Let's talk about Césaire.
Okay.
What was his importance as a writer?
I think that Césaire is the author of Negritude.
Yes.
And negritude is not N-word. And I think that when he invented the negritude, he thinks that negritude is the way of answer about what he calls negrory, colonial negrory.
So it's a way of rethinking the situation of the Black person, in this case, the African or the Caribbean person in the world, after having been located somewhere else by colonizers.
Is the answer of Negro about the situation of colonialism, the situation of esclavagism, and this situation is the invention of the new way to live in the world, about after the colonialism and after the esclavagism.
As when as if I'm remembering correctly, the notion of negritude came about in the late 30s when Aimé Césaire was still a student in Paris.
Yes, when he was student in Paris and was student at École Normale Supérieure in La Rue d'Ulm in 1935, and he thinks that is the way of the students to answer about this situation of negritude, this situation of colonialism.
And it was a term that he developed with two other thinkers and scholars.
With Senghor and Damas, yes. And I think that is just the answer of the young Blacks in Paris. The young Blacks in Paris about the situation of colonialism, the situation of the dependence, the situation of domination, which have led Africa and Caribbean between 2 centuries.
Yes, so it's a liberating term in a lot of ways.
Yes, and I think that colonialism is a domination, and they think that the negritude is the liberation of the young. In 1935, in Paris, is liberation of those youngs, is the way to answer of that situation of the Blacks in Paris. Yes.
Yes. So what I know about Césaire then is after his studies in Paris, he went back to Martinique, and of course it was wartime. He started a journal. He was already writing wonderful poetry with a surrealistic bent to it. So his poetry, I would say, is much more esoteric and enigmatic, difficult to get around, a handle on, than his theater work. And he didn't actually start writing theater until the 60s.
Yes, but I think that when he came back in Martinique in 1939, he has write his novel, big novel, with Cahiers de l'Utopie Natale in 1939, and he began to work against the colonialism with his review, and the review is topic from 1941 to 1945, and during this period he began to write his theater, and I think that is the beginning of the thinker of Une Tempête.
As early as the 40s.
Yes, in 1945, when he began to write this his novel or his
notebook to return to my native land.
Yes, when he write his Cahiers of Return of Pays Natal, the return of native land, is the period when he began to write even his theater novel, and I think that is the beginning of rethinking of what niggers or what slaves can write about the life in the Caribbean.
Right. So you're kind of using that term in a very ironic way when you say it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Then I think I'll stop right now and just add that what I know from the 60s, when he did the three great plays that we know him for, and Lanise is interested in at least two of them, right?
Yes.
The Tragedy of King Christopher, as well as A Tempest, and you're working on both of them.
Yes, simultaneously.
Yes. And his third play is called A Season in the Congo, and it's about Patrice Lumumba. And these plays came to be in part because at that particular time in the 60s, there was this wonderful director named Jean-Marie Serrault, who was very interested in doing plays by African writers. He did plays also by Katab Yassine. So he was also working with North African writers. And he had a company that was very unusual for the time in France, and is unusual for now, in fact, which was a company that was multi-racial and multi-ethnic, which permitted him to do these plays with cast with African and Caribbean actors from many different parts of the Caribbean and Africa, Francophone, of course. Okay, I'll stop here, but some of you may have questions that you want to ask, and we'll get to questions at the end. And then I want to turn to Lanise and say, how is it that you became interested in Aimé Césaire? Because he's not exactly a household word, no, in America. Yeah.
No, well, I am a Haitian. I was born in Haiti, in Saint Michel, Haiti. And I grew up in Northern California, and throughout my education, I've been classically trained as an actor. And so one of my colleagues shared with me The Tragedy of King Christophe, which is one of Aimé Césaire's great work. And I am directing The Tragedy of King Christophe right now at the House Theater in Chicago. And so that is actually my entry point into Aimé Césaire. And then from there, I discovered A Tempest, which was a thrill, as you can imagine, as a classically trained actor, to find an adaptation of The Tempest that actually fits into a lot of the interpretations that people generally take with The Tempest, putting it in the Caribbean, placing it in a place where Black people can be enslaved. And so here is Aimé Césaire, who actually unpacks all of the colonialist undertones of The Tempest. And he serves it up to the audience in a way that is raw and impactful, and creates indelible change, essentially. Because as I've started to mine the text and understand negritude, which I didn't quite understand until this research, I now know how it resonates in our times today. I grew up as an Afrocentric African-American woman, Haitian-American woman, and Aimé Césaire has enabled me as an artist to understand what that really means to be Afrocentric.
So do you understand negritude as an Afrocentric, a way of conceptualizing the world from an Afrocentric position?
I believe so. In my research, I read an essay by Lawrence M. Porter, and he talked about how negritude is the active attempt to reject racism, but also the active assertion of African heritage by resisting assimilation.
Yeah.
And being Afrocentric puts you and your heritage in the center of everything that you do.
So it changes the positionality from being always the other to being
That's exactly right.
the subject. Yeah.
That's
So
exactly right.
what do you think Césaire does in A Tempest to anchor it more in the story of African descended peoples?
Well, he's done several things. The largest thing being shifting the verse, the Shakespearean verse, to prose. And he did this and able to make it more accessible, and also to create a social equalizer. So as we know in Shakespeare, the verse shifts and the language shifts depending on class. in A Tempest, he took away all of that. He said everyone is equal from the very beginning. And he also added Eshu, a Yoruban deity, which it harkens back to the negritude movement of really grasping onto one's heritage and having Eshu come into the middle of the play and almost assist Caliban by making him right, by making all of his declarations to Shango throughout the piece, making that come to fruition in a way, helping the audience understand that Caliban, his traditions, his heritage, his point of view are valid in a way that in Shakespeare's Tempest are completely invalidated. And so in this adaptation, you see Prospero being less glorified and being more diminished. And conversely, you see Caliban being glorified because he actually has space to expand, to articulate and express himself. You see a scene between Ariel and Caliban that you don't see in Shakespeare's original text. And so you recognize that bringing in these little pepperings of tradition and an Africanness is in celebration of the negritude that Aimé Césaire purports and talks about throughout his work.
And what about, I wanted to pick up what you were saying about the language, because one of the things that I think happens in A Tempest is that Prospero, in fact, has much more vulgar and brutal language. He's much less poetic than Ariel and Caliban, who have the best lines.
Yes.
So, and which is also very interesting and the most poetic, right? And the most creative. And I think it would be interesting to talk about the rapport between the two of them, which is entirely different than it is in Shakespeare, right?
Oh, it absolutely is. And you start off with Prospero mocking and emotionally abusing Caliban. And in Shakespeare's original text, you see the effect of that abuse on Caliban. He's very downtrodden. He's shrunken in size and in stature. One of the things that I love about A Tempest is the fact that Caliban stands upright. And that's a huge contrast, because in Shakespeare's original text, Caliban is always hunched over on all fours. You see him actually becoming the beast that he's called throughout the piece. And in Aimé Césaire's rendition, he actually gives him an intellect. He gives him a point of view. And he is mostly impervious to Prospero's japes, which is a beautiful thing to see. Someone who is essentially enslaved, but yet knows himself, yet is centered in who he is enough to not be beaten to a place where he does not have a self-esteem at all, which is the case with Shakespeare's Caliban. And
yet there are moments when Caliban, when Prospero's Caliban says, for example, yes, I learned your language, yeah, but I learned it in order so that I can do the work that you asked me to do.
Yeah.
So I think there are all kinds of hints in Prospero, in The Tempest rather, of a Caliban that can be born out of that by Césaire. And I also think that once you've read Césaire's A Tempest, you can never read The Tempest in the same way again.
No, you can't. You can't, because you get all of the colonialist nuances of The Tempest, and you can never forgive them again.
Yeah.
And so one of the biggest one being in the beginning of Shakespeare's text, it says a new island its description is there is no inhabitants on this island. So he's, from the very beginning, he is establishing that Ariel's Caliban are not human, and so therefore can be enslaved because they are the original inhabitants, the indigenous people on the island, but Shakespeare has completely discounted their experience. And it's all about validating one's history and one's experience, which Aimé Césaire really tapped into. He validates Caliban's version of history and says, no, this is actually what happened. And in Shakespeare's text, he only validates Prospero's perspective. And in my research, I was curious as to like why Aimé Césaire called it A Tempest. And I discovered that Shakespeare's text is, this is the only tempest. This is it, right? This is the history from Prospero's point of view. But with Aimé Césaire, he said, because of the times, because of the global unrest that was happening in the 50s and 60s, and acknowledging that, he said, this is going to be called A Tempest because this is one revolt of many. So that was a very powerful discovery that I made in my research of understanding that this is one tempest. And Aimé Césaire is acknowledging all the others that will come.
And so you say this in your book, in fact, that because there's quite a debate about whether or not Césaire's plays are actually tragedies, that they end with people dying or they end with people not achieving what it is that they wish to achieve or being killed, right? But what Romuald says in his book is it's the beginning of something that's going to happen later on that's going to take people out of the tragic mode. Right? And which is what you're finding, what you found. Yeah. So can you tell us how the revolt takes place in the play through the relationship between Caliban and Ariel?
Well, it actually begins with the first thing that Caliban does is not answer to the name that Prospero gives him, right? And then you know something is immediately wrong in this relationship. And he then comes into the scene and says, no, this is my name. And I don't respond to the slave master's name. And that informs the relationship between Ariel and Caliban because Ariel is playing along. Ariel is being the kind of docile slave that Prospero wants. And Caliban is resentful of that and cannot respect Ariel for being the kind of Uncle Tom-ish depiction of captivity. And so one of the things that I love about this play is the standoff between Caliban and Ariel when they talk about the differences between how they deal with their situation. And I love that Aimé Césaire actually drew from, again, what was happening in the world with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So Malcolm X being Caliban and Martin Luther King being Ariel. And the conversations between these two people who are both anti-imperialists who want essentially the same thing, but have different methods for obtaining it.
And in their big scene together, they end up calling each other brother.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Which is really pretty important, I think.
Yes, it is. It is, but it acknowledges that they are on the same team, but using different weapons.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to ask you some questions about what was difficult for you in thinking about how you were going to interpret this, what you might not forward, what you wanted to make very central to what you were doing. Because eventually I think you're thinking of this reading as preparing a staging of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would love to stage a full production. Well, the biggest challenge in the beginning was just casting. How did I want to approach the casting? Because Aimé Césaire wanted this piece to be for a Black company, right?
Yes, and he calls it a psychodrama. Where he says there's an ambience of psychodrama, right? So there's something of a carnivalesque exorcism that could be fundamental to this. And I say exorcism not in the sense of that awful film, but
Yeah.
meaning more, acting out and so on, and finding joy in acting out.
Well, it starts with almost a play within a play, right? You have these random players who the master of ceremonies says, who wants to play what, and they divvy up the characters. And so that is a very classic Shakespearean play within a play kind of scenario. Going into casting, I didn't quite know how to deal with the masks that are in the top of the show, the epilogue, or the prologue rather, where the characters are finding their footing. And so with this reading, we actually cast it with traditional casting, which is predominantly Eurocentric casting, with the few of the characters being multiracial, and then making sure that we were very specific with Caliban and Ariel, and Issue being of African descent.
Yeah.
Because there is an element of colorism that I wanted to tease out that's so imperative. As a West Indian, colorism is a huge part of our history. And Aimé Césaire recognized that, because he literally said Ariel, a mulatto, a biracial person. And so I really wanted to honor what he was aiming to do in those casting settings. And so we somewhat landed on it. With a full-on production, I think that we would have more time to take care and find people that actually adhere to the hues that we're looking for, but it does take some doing to be that specific. And so that was probably the biggest hurdle that I've had during this process.
Right. And I think I told you that when we did this at the University of Wisconsin, I did not have enough actors of color. And so everyone wore masks. Everyone wore masks. And we added a prologue in which we asked for forgiveness for reinterpreting it in a certain kind of a way, because we wanted to honor, of course, Césaire as well.
Yeah.
So I think that for this play, that for Césaire's play, perhaps the hardest thing to get one's head around, and in classes I've debated this with students on several occasions, is what actually happens at the end of A Tempest, what the meaning of that is at the end of A Tempest. And I was wondering how you have landed on that ending, because at the ending, I'll just quickly say what the ending is. In the ending, Prospero cannot leave the island. And as you know, in The Tempest, the whole idea is to get the heck off the island, return to Milan, have his land, marry Milan in Naples with the children, with the love story, right? But and we don't quite know what happens to Caliban, whether we expect that he's pulled along when Prospero goes back to Milan or not, because at the very end of The Tempest, Prospero says more or less to Caliban, get back to the house.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has that wonderful epilogue in which he breaks his magic wand and so on. But at the end of A Tempest, Caliban and Prospero are the only people left on the island, and they cannot leave each other. What does that mean?
Well, I spoke with A. James Arnold about this a few weeks ago, and he believes that it has more to do with Aimé Césaire being someone who's from Martinique, a Martinican, and that they didn't they had the occupation of the French until late 70s. I don't think they achieved their independence until 79, was it? And so he understood what it was like to have someone occupying a country in the 20th century. One of the other departures with this ending that's different from The Tempest, Shakespeare's The Tempest, is the fact that Caliban does not ask for grace at the end. And this is huge because in this post-colonialist play that Aimé Césaire has created for us, he has given, again, Caliban a strength that the original Caliban does not have. And so Caliban, Aimé Césaire's Caliban, refuses to humble himself in any way or assume the posture of someone who's done anything wrong. And he continues to set forth to fight and revolt again. And as you said, like, there's an ellipses after this play. You don't know what's going to happen next. And so I think it's the combination of Aimé Césaire knowing and seeing the effects of post-colonialism that still remains today. As I told you a week ago, Judy, I was in Belize this past holiday season, and you still see the occupation of Americans there. And it's stark and it's stunning and it's devastating in a lot of ways. And even as a Haitian, going back to Haiti, seeing the remnants of the French colonialists, and going to Senegal and seeing remnants of the French colonialists there, because a lot of French people, they go there for vacation. And so you see that people have not left the countries that they have colonized. And I think that is the point. I think Aimé Césaire just landed on the point that though we have been emancipated, we have not been left alone.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it and thinking about it. I've thought about this a lot, of course, and I tend to be an optimistic person. so I see the ending as a real liberation, and with especially because in picturing it, there's Caliban up in the air somewhere. His last words are freedom, freedom, liberty, liberty, oh, liberty, oh. And there's Prospero down on his knees, this old, quaking old man who is completely impotent at that point. But he cannot be if Caliban is not, because he needs to be the master. And the way that he needs to think of himself as the master is to have an enslaved person. But I mean, this is not so different from what you're saying. It's just looking at it from a slightly different angle, right? So if one of the things that was interesting in the original staging of it by Serrault is that he thought hard about how he would picture Prospero, and he dressed him as a combination of a planter, so in a white costume, right, and a Western heroine, or hero rather. So he had pistols and he had bullets across his chest. Do you see Prospero in your mind?
I do, but I'm not convinced that that's the Prospero that I would take to a full production.
Well, I'm not suggesting you to.
Yeah, well, just because it's interesting because the original Tempest was somewhat in the Mediterranean, and this Tempest, I mean, Aimé Césaire was inspired by what happened in Madagascar, right? And so it's a completely different atmosphere. And I would love to see Prospero, because usually the Tempests that I've seen has had Prospero still kind of in European garb. And I would love to see a Prospero who has been influenced by the tropics. What does that look like? Yeah, I think that it would be a combination between him trying to keep his nobleman stature and clothes that have become frayed and disintegrated by the sea air, and then him in a straw hat.
Or a pith helmet, maybe. Which is really the sign of the colonizer for Africans, right? Yeah. And one of the things that is very interesting that Césaire does about Prospero is he takes all the magic away from him. So there's no magic robe, right? The magic robe, which is so important in The Tempest, which allows him to become that in this magic wand, right? It's not there at all. So, but the clothing then becomes important in another way. But I think that it's interesting to look at how he is unmagified or demagified by, and all of his power derives from technology, right? So, I mean, that might be an interesting thing to think about in terms of staging as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And Aimé Césaire talks about how now Prospero in his rendition is actually reliant on Caliban in a way that Shakespearean's Prospero is not. And so what does that look like? So that's really interesting.
And when he's able to control everybody, you know, it's partially because he has a taser in his back pocket, right? Right. And tear gas.
Yeah.
And a whole arsenal of what a police state uses to control its population. And not just police states, or depending on how you define a police state, right? Yeah. So I want to turn to Romuald and ask him a question about guano, because the play is also obviously a critique of capitalism, right? And I think the big sign for capitalism in A Tempest is guano. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
About the capitalism?
About the guano and the capitalism. You remember that part? Well, let me talk about it, and then maybe Lanise will talk about it. So the honest counselor, Gonzalo, who is a good guy in Shakespeare's play, right? In Césaire's play is silly. He's a silly character, basically. And you want him to be the good guy because he has helped Prospero and Miranda out. But of course, he's helped out this person who is unacceptable, totally, and more unacceptable as the play goes on. And when he gets to the island, he's an optimist like me, totally unacceptable, I suppose. But what he is enthusiastic about is that he discovers birdshit. He discovers guano, right? And he thinks, oh, we can become rich on this. So that it's not a tragedy for Gonzalo to be shipwrecked on this island, because he's already imagining how he's going to exploit it.
Yes, but that's a huge colonialist mindset as well, right? Because every colony had a special, agricultural value to that region, and so it's such a brilliant touch that these people find guano and want to monetize it immediately.
Yeah. So we get that equation that money equals shit, right?
I know.
Which is a little ironic. It's not sugar, right? It's not blood. It's not
part of the humor of it, the parody, right?
Yeah. So will your reading be somewhat funny?
I hope so. We have some really funny actors, some actors from The Tempest, or not The Tempest, pardon, The Alchemist. that was hilarious, a farce that was done at Red Bull this past December. So those clowns, they're true clowns.
Right.
Will really tease out the humor in it. And I do want it to be funny because there are so many layers, and I think that the uncomfortable layers are way more palatable through humor.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's probably pretty true. It's a little early to turn things over to the audience right away, but I think it would be great if you wouldn't mind reading Caliban's last lines.
Okay.
Which is not exactly at the very end of the play, but it is the penultimate moment of the play when Caliban speaks to Prospero about what he thinks Prospero is. And then Prospero has a retort to it, but it doesn't have much force. It certainly doesn't have the same force, at least in my perception of it, my reading of it.
I agree. Here it is. You must understand, Prospero. For years I bowed my head. For years I stomached all of it. Your insults, your ingratitude, and worst of all, your degrading when all the rest, your condescension. And now it's over. Do you hear? Of course. For the moment, you're still the stronger, but I don't care two hoots about your power, or your dogs either, your police or your intentions. And do you know why I don't care? Do you want to know? It's because I know I'll have you. You'll be impaled and on a stake. You'll have sharpened yourself. You'll have impaled yourself. Prospero, you're a great illusionist, and you know all about lies. And you lied to me so much, lied about the world, lied about yourself, and you ended up by imposing on me an image of myself. Underdeveloped in your words, incompetent. And that's how you forced me to see myself. And I hate that image. And it is false. And now I know you old cancer, and I also know myself. I know that one day, my bare fist alone will be enough to crush your world. The old world is falling apart. Isn't it true? Just look. It even bores you to death. And by the way, you have a chance to finish it off. You can get the hell out. You can go back to Europe. But there's no hope of that. I'm sure you won't leave. That makes me laugh. Your mission, your vocation is to get on my wick. And that's why you'll stay. Like those men who established the colonies and can no longer live elsewhere. An old addict. That's what you are.
Yeah, thank you. It was great. So I think it might be time to open this discussion to people who've come and might have some questions to ask. And then Courtney will be getting questions from people online. And maybe Romuald also wants to ask you a question or two. Do you, Romuald? No, no. Okay. All right. So are there some questions? Anything coming from online?
Not at the moment, but I solicited some more. If you have questions, please let us know.
I'm just not too familiar with Césaire's work. So does his version of A Tempest take place in Shakespearean times, or does it take place in a modern setting during the 40s and 50s?
Or 60s?
I don't believe it takes place in Shakespearean times. I mean, we have a scholar with us, but I believe it takes place in the time that it was written, which was, it was published in 1969, but it translates to modern age quite easily. So I think the time is now.
Yeah, I would say that too, right? The metaphorical thrust of it is such that it can happen at the time in which it's performed. It doesn't have to be situated in a particular time. Yeah. Is there another question?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you so much for this meeting. You mentioned, Judith, that capitalism is connected with colonialism in the text, and it's what you read of it. And I was thinking that Lévi-Strauss, who was emphasizing this fact that colonialism is the frame where capitalism was first shaped. And I think that The Tempest is a way to grip and catch something about this election.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right now, because we shouldn't forget that Césaire was a member of the Communist Party and left, of course, at the moment, left at the point where the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. But he was very strongly connected and ideologically, I'd say, attuned with what communism was about. And I think when we go back to discourse on colonialism, you can see exactly that point, and not just that point, but also the point that Europe had just experienced a horrible Second World War, and it had experienced genocide. It had experienced Nazism. And what Césaire says that's so shocking when you read it for the first time is that Europe brought it upon itself because it had already been doing that stuff through slavery and colonialism. So what's the difference? It was just behaving as Europe. And so this to a certain extent is in the play, but it's lightened up quite a bit. Yeah.
But even Lévi-Strauss, who was not communist, was saying that they are not only close one to the other, colonialism and capitalism, but it's really the way that made capitalism develop colonialism.
Yeah, and I've certainly read theoreticians, and I think of some of the African playwrights that I've worked with who feel that the really beginning of capitalism was chattel slavery.
Yeah.
That the goods that were put in circulation globally were human beings. Yeah.
Actually, Morrison said always that the United States are the first country in the world because they had this country had 200 years free workers,
Free labor.
but this country is not able to recognize it.
Yes. Oh yes, Sylvain.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the conversation, so you might have actually tackled this question before. That's actually a question for Lanise as a stage director, because like the intertextuality, of course, is very pregnant, and is a sort of like the framing of the whole play in the title itself, obviously. And there is something very political in this gesture too, to rewrite one of the monuments of the Anglophone canon. And that's also a question that I do have myself sometimes as a practitioner, is that is there a way to transpose that gesture on stage? How to make the intertextuality heard and the sort of spectral reference to Shakespeare, but also the displacement and reframing of the Shakespearean
Universe,
canonicity in some ways. If you would see a way to make these echoes heard on stage for an audience that might not immediately read or be able to read this set of references. I'm not sure my question is very clear, but
I missed that last part, who aren't able to read.
for an audience who might not be able to get the references to the Shakespearean original text.
Mm-hmm.
And so how to make that, I don't know, heard or visible or palpable for the audience, that the play is also this political displacement of a canonical dramatic text?
Well, my first answer is, do they have to know that it's Shakespeare? And I only present that as an option just simply because Shakespeare is the poster child for Eurocentric and kind of supremacist views, in the sense of people refer to and compare everything to Shakespeare. And it wasn't until the last 15 or so years that African-American literature was considered classic. And so I think that in Aimé Césaire's efforts to write against Shakespeare, to really illuminate the political point of views that you're talking about, this is for an audience that usually have been exposed to Shakespeare. If they haven't, then they are seeing a play anew. They are seeing a fresh interpretation of a story long told. And that is actually exciting in itself. There's so much research that needs to be done to understand the political nature, the undertones and nuances within this actual text. And finding out for myself, mining the definitions of negritude and homogeny and all of those things that we are used to as a culture and have kind of acquiesced ourselves to when it comes to Shakespeare and literature being defaulting to a white voice. And so I think that what's exciting about Aimé Césaire's point of view is that he starts off almost, again, a play within a play, making a nod to, this is how we're going to act. This is how we're going to approach this text that I didn't necessarily make up. And sidebar, The Tempest is one of two of Shakespeare's canon that was actually all made up, all fictitious. The other plays in Shakespeare's canon are actually born out of history itself. And so creating a piece from something that didn't exist anyways, from a fictional story, gives Aimé Césaire a license to do whatever he wants essentially with it. And so as a director, I would just highlight those iconic things that we know of Prospero, giving him a staff, which I'm going to do on Monday, giving him a staff. So those are the images that we know of Prospero. I think every Tempest on the planet has Prospero with a staff. Was playing with the physicality of Caliban. Aimé Césaire, again, didn't create a Caliban that's stalking and cowardly and hunched over. And so how does he move regardless? Does he have clothes? What are those, the clothes that is on him? What does that say about the character itself? Because a lot of times you see Caliban naked, basically, with a loincloth or something like that, right? And so Aimé Césaire actually wants to make Caliban a little bit more civilized in a way that we've never seen him before. So those are the main key ways that you can reference to the original text. And Ariel, what is Ariel? Usually Ariel is in a onesie and flittering about. And so here in Aimé Césaire's rendition, we have the option of making him a little bit more grounded, him or her a little bit more naturalistic than preternatural.
Yeah, and mind you, there have been ways in which I've been around for a long time, so I've seen a lot of The Tempest. And Peter Brook did a really interesting The Tempest quite a while ago, in which he made a very specific casting choices. So Ariel was played by Bakary Sangari, who before he entered the Comédie Française, and he's a Malian actor. And Caliban was played by a British actor who had a major film role in Gunter Grass's film The Tin Drum. It was Gunter Grass's novel, obviously, that was made into. And I can't remember this actor's name, David something or other. Anyway, it was quite interesting, and it was, of course, visually stunning, because you're right, one does not expect that. And Brook was experimenting with a lot of things of that nature at the time. Yeah.
He was notorious for that.
I think, Sylvain, for this question, that one of the other things that happens in the play is that every once in a while there's a line directly out of Shakespeare, like "Oh Brave New World," right? So that the intertextuality is going to be very obvious for anybody who knows The Tempest, but maybe, and that's something that really needs to be thought about a lot, I think, is why he wants to have added, the only character he adds is Eshu.
Yes.
So, right? So why Eshu?
My great character.
Your great character.
Is the only one we make the difference between The Tempest of Shakespeare and A Tempest of Césaire is Eshu.
In terms of characters. And why? Who is Eshu?
Eshu is, how can I say that? In the play, he says that when it's order, I'm the disorder. When there is a disorder, I'm the order. There is Eshu.
Yeah, so I mean, I think he's the spirit of carnival, right? The upside down character.
Yes, he's a character of carnival.
The trickster character. And he's there to switch everything around. Exactly. Maybe he's Aimé Césaire.
Yeah, making a cameo.
Yeah. Maybe that's possible. So
it's my favorite character, in this play. Eshu is this character that Shakespeare cannot think about, because he's not where we think that we can be to the reality, when the play, what is the play? The play is a theater where we think that in Shakespeare we have the end before we beginning is the tragedy. And in the play of Césaire, we don't know what is the tragedy, with the end of the tragedy. And I think that Eshu is the symbolic of that
of continuity.
Yes.
Of a non-ending.
Yes.
And a way of thinking, not in a linear way.
Yeah, and that is the difference between Shakespeare and Césaire.
Does that resonate with the?
Yes, that absolutely does. And I think that, well, I read that issue is the glimmer of negritude that Césaire talked about, or Césaire was part of that movement as well, because Caliban is trying to invoke the spirit of Shango throughout, right? And then later on,
Who's a god of war, right? Shango is a god of war.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah,
thunder.
yeah.
Yeah.
the god of war and thunder. And then a larger deity shows up. And that's Eshu.
But Eshu for me is also a little bit like what I think of as the god of the artist. The one you can't get your hands around, right? The one that's always slipping outside of your fingers. The one as soon as you want to put them in this camp and say, this is who you are. That's not who they are because they're an artist. And that now I think that kind of character shows up in Shakespeare when we think about Puck in A Midsummer's Night's Dream, for example. So it's not as though it's Mercury that shows up in other plays.
Yeah.
But I think that there are ways, there might be a way in which by using Eshu, Césaire is also escaping from himself, or you know what I mean? Not escaping from a certain too strict definition of what the play might actually be about, which is why it's going to allow us to keep on reinterpreting it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's nothing more arresting than adding an African deity to a Shakespearean play. Like the Elizabethans would just, they would clutch their pearls if they knew. And so I think it's a very—
I think you're thinking about 19th century bourgeois, maybe not Elizabethans. They were probably more open to these kinds of things than we ever have been.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
There's just a couple from the web audience, quick ones. Katrina Laporta thanks all of the panelists from Brooklyn, New York. She wonders if Lanise hopes to stage a full production in New York or Chicago.
I would love to do it in New York, ideally with Red Bull. We'll see. Right now, I am the Drama League Classical Directing Fellow in partnership with Red Bull, and that's who's hosting the reading on Monday. And so they would be the perfect place to produce this kind of production because they specialize in classical theater. And so, yeah, the dream would be to do it in New York.
And one of the things that we talked about earlier is there are two translations that at least I know of A Tempest. One by Richard Miller, who's an American, and one by
Crispin.
Yes, Crispin, which is the one that you chose, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about why you chose that one.
Well, I chose Crispin because the language was more poetic. I thought that it harkened back to the Shakespearean, not rhyme, but just the flow of it landed better for me. And that's why I chose the Crispin. Yeah, because Aimé Césaire is known for his poetry, and I can imagine just the challenge of translating it from French. And I think Crispin did that in a way that maintained the poetry that I could appreciate.
Yeah, I think it's a really good translation. I think the Miller translation is fine, but the Crispin is better.
You're right.
It is better, isn't it? Yeah.
Okay, and we hope everyone will join us for the staged reading of Une Tempête on Monday, February 28th at 7:30 p.m. with director Lanise Antoine Shelley. The next question is Césaire's 1960s political triptych of plays is quite unlike his earlier, more surrealist, quote, lyric oratorio, end quote, a Les Chiens se taisent. Why the change? How do you think Césaire's idea about theater, poetry, or politics may have changed or developed by the 1960s? Merci pour this excellent discussion. Can't wait for Monday's performance.
Do you want to take that one?
About Elisha Césaire?
Yeah.
About oratorio?
Do you think that the change in language and the change in style also reflects a change in politics? Why this move from surrealism to something more readable?
I don't know if surrealism is related to his plays, but I think that Aimé Césaire is the first play he writes in 1942 or 1945.
Yes, and it's more like an oratorio.
Yes, it's an oratorio, and as I write in my book, I think that is the first play, which is the foundation of all his theater, all his plays. And Elections is the first play he writes. And I think that when you read La Tragédie du Roi Christophe or Une Tempête, and I think that there is some relation between that oratorio and those plays. Elections is the first tragedy in Caribbean, in first tragedy in Martinique, because before there was no right, there was no plays, there was no theater in Martinique or Caribbean.
Well, there was, but it was colonial theater, right?
No,
Or it was theater, but there was theater performed.
there's no plays in Martinique, even
Really?
even in colonial era.
I trust you to have done
Yes.
in the archives.
No, even in colonial era, there is no.
That's astonishing
Yes,
because in
there's
Haiti,
no
there was
place.
a lot. There was a
Yeah.
lot of theater that went on.
It's the first place, yes.
Yeah. Huh.
Well, maybe that's why Aimé Césaire loved Haiti. Because he did have an obsession with Haitian culture. Maybe that's why, because the arts was flourishing there at that time.
I think so. And I think from what I have read about him and from what I know his daughter, I've translated some of his daughter's plays, Aimé Césaire. And Haiti is the first Black country that won its independence from a European power. That is powerful as a symbol. It's home, right? It's kind of the mother home for, So I think that, and then that energy that came from that victory created a lot of artists.
Yeah.
Artists came from that, were energized by that, and they were free to write as
Yeah.
well.
Yes.
Yeah,
We did.
and paint
Mm-hmm.
and sing. You know,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yes, quick.
Yes, speaking of Haiti, I hope everyone will join us for the Festival des Cinq Continents, the last week of April, where we are mettre à l'honneur Haiti for the week of the 25th to the 29th. Quick last one, what will best help a Shakespearean neophyte, quote, get this play? Any homework assignments?
I missed that question. I'm sorry.
What will best help a Shakespearean neophyte, quote, get this play? Any homework assignments?
I think that you'll get this play. Aimé Césaire wrote it so that those who are self-professed neophytes will understand it and walk away with some impact. And so again, I don't think you have to know Shakespeare to enjoy this play, this adaptation. And that was the purpose for him writing it. He wanted to make sure that the Martinicans saw themselves, saw the possibilities in the things that he wrote, and wanted to make his work accessible to all. And I think that this play is definitely that.
Yeah, and I'd like to get back to the question that was asked about moving from surrealism to plays that are more readable, let's put it that way, or more audience friendly. And it has something to do with what the nature of theater itself is as a collaborative act. And it was the meeting with Jean-Marie Serrault that changed his writing style. So you talk about this in your book, but I know this from an interview that I did with Césaire when I was a kid. And it was just wonderful to be able to meet him. But they worked in harmony. Césaire was at all of the rehearsals. He rewrote when Serrault wasn't quite happy with the way a scene worked, and they allowed the actors to participate. So there is a kind of way that his plays are collective creations, not entirely, right? But we don't, with les chiens se taisaient, or, and I don't know how that's translated into English, but literally it's, and the dogs shut up, right? And they shut up because somebody else was speaking, right?
Yeah.
And we know what dogs are in the Caribbean. So in terms of what they mean, right? For enslaved peoples. And so, there you get that kind of anger already starting. I think I just lost my train of thought. What was I talking about?
How the audience can best prepare.
Well, yes, and what the changes from the one style to the other. Maybe the best preparation is just to read the text.
Yep.
Yeah, or even to read Shakespeare and then watch and see what Césaire does to Shakespeare if you can't get your hands on Une Tempête.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great homework. Read The Tempest and then listen to it anew with A Tempest.
Yeah. Okay, is that it?
Oui.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for listening in. Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Okay.